Hey everyone, welcome back to Midwest Chicana Podcast. We have an amazing guest tonight and an amazing co-host with us. So we just want to thank everybody for coming back and listening to our podcast. First and foremost, I want to introduce my co-host, Lucero. How are you this evening?
Hello, I'm doing well. It's been a busy day, but I'm really happy to be here.
And Lucero has published her first book of poems. Please, everybody, this is like an amazing accomplishment. And you are the bestseller.
Yeah, as of yesterday, I'm on the top 5 bestsellers list on the website. So that is definitely I'm in disbelief still. It's such a great feeling. I couldn't have done it without my supporters at this point. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry, we are working off of 2 screens here, and I just kind of seen myself not be able to look at the screen correctly. So here I go. Next, I want to introduce our wonderful host, our wonderful guest, Dr. Jean Chavez. Thank you so much, Dr. Jean, for being here with us.
That's my pleasure. Great to be with you.
You are bringing this is your second time with us, and you are bringing now the wonderful information around the Chicano culture and the Chicano movement that came to Kansas City. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm going to go a little back in history to kind of put it into context so that we get a fuller picture than just thinking about the Chicano movement, which was, sort of a snapshot in time. But yeah, that's will be the emphasis.
Well, we're excited to have you. And Lucero, please jump in with any questions you have. Viewers, if you have any questions, I'll be monitoring back here kind of behind the scenes. I'll be helping Dr. Jean Chavez move around his PowerPoint, and I'll be watching for the comments. But Lucero, please jump in with any questions you have. Dr. Jean Chavez, are you ready to begin?
Sure. Let me say this. I would love to have this as interactive as possible. I know it's difficult, but I would encourage people if I, talk about a slide as we go through them and they say, hey, could you expand on that a little bit? Or can you give me a reference? I'd be happy to do that so that we make it less like a lecture and more like a charla, sitting in our living rooms, talking to one another about history.
Of course. Yes, I am. I'm very excited about this. And when Diana asked me to be her co-host and to kind of just see which one I would like to join, this one specifically caught my attention very much because I did a lot of research on the Chicano movement and have seen so many movies and just really worked in a conference that emphasized this in Southern California when I was in college. And so I just actually recently, 2 days ago, just kind of in preparation for this, rewatched Stand and Deliver and Walkout. And so I just continuously, I've seen those movies both countless times. But I'm really interested to see how that Chicano movement has come to Kansas City and how it came to be, because I'm very familiar with it in California, but for sure Kansas City, I'm excited to see the parallels and the differences in how it came about.
Yeah, and what part of California were you in?
So I was in Azusa, so near Pasadena, so kind of just the outer Inland Empire.
Yeah. Very familiar with it. I grew up part of my life in LA, so nice. More around East Los and Chinatown area. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
Well, let me begin by talking a little bit about the brief history of the Latino. And I'm going to use the word Latino because I'm from the old school, and so I feel more comfortable with that. But I certainly understand Latinx term and the desire to be inclusive, and I have no problem with that. So, but probably Latino, Chicano, Mexicano, various other terms, and when we think about those labels, it's how one self-identifies certainly, and what they feel comfortable with. So, if I'm in East Los, I'm definitely Chicano.
Yes, 100%.
In America, I'm Latino because that's a little more inclusive for them. So let's go to the next slide, and let me just sort of begin with two icons of the Chicano movement. And one is on the right, Corky Gonzalez, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. Actually, I knew Corky personally. I grew up in Denver. He lived on the east side. I lived on the east side. And so my uncle actually trained him in golden gloves. And so I got to know him over the years. And he was a tremendous person. He wasn't highly educated, didn't have he had some college, but not, highly educated in that area. But he was an intelligent leader of people and charismatic. And I also had the opportunity to meet Cesar Chavez, and because we shared the same last name on our father's side, people always ask me, "Well, are you related to Cesar Chavez?" They usually say, Spanish speaking, and I say, "Oh yeah, he's my uncle." And so when I finally met him, when I was president of the National Association for Bilingual Education, we had him as a speaker at one of our functions. And so I told him that story. I said, Cesar, people always ask me, am I related to you? And I always say, yes, he's my uncle. And then I say, no, I'm just kidding. But he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, look, from now on, you're my nephew. Don't worry about it.
Oh, my goodness.
That's the way
that
Cesar
is amazing.
Very humble person. But for those who've never read or heard dramatized, and it's on YouTube, I Am Joaquin, they really need to do that because it really is sort of a historical epic that Corky developed to really talk about the experience of Latinos throughout our history, from the days of the indigenous people, the conquest, all the way down to certainly the struggle of the Chicano movement. So yes. I would encourage people to follow the link and look up that epic poem by Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. Let's go to the next slide. The struggle to survive the American macro culture, most people of color in the United States have had to struggle to survive what I call the American macro culture. And what I mean by that, when you think of the United States as of immigrants, we have a dominant culture in the United States. And we'll go to the next slide, and then we might come back to this one, but I can talk about it in the next slide. So if you would imagine this construct that I developed to sort of explain how we are configured in the United States of America. We have a dominant culture. In that dominant culture, English is the dominant language. We are a competitive culture. We are individualistic. So that, the first thing a kid wants in the American macro culture is what? A car.
A car? Yep.
Because they want to be on their own. They want to, and that's the dominant value of individualism, so that we have nurtured picking ourselves up by our own bootstraps, don't depend on anybody, you go out there and you make your way. So that's a dominant value in the American macro culture. But when you think about all of the micro cultures represented by the various smaller circles within, and we're all within the United States, but some of us are marginalized to various degrees, depending on our willingness to assimilate into the American macro culture. And thus I have the circles overlapping to various degrees, depending on sort of my perception of how groups have assimilated into the American macro culture, or sometimes called mainstream culture. If you look at the smallest circle there, the Amish community, they're definitely Americans, but they choose not to assimilate into the American macro culture. And in fact, the dominant value in their culture is to separate themselves from the dominant culture. Whereas other groups, again, assimilate to various degrees. And some of us, the further you get away from the dominant macro culture and embrace values and behaviors that are more like your microculture, then you might speak Spanish all the time. I had a great aunt, for example, if we look at the green Latino circle there, she lived in her own little world in northern New Mexico, grew up and lived in the same county, Mora County, New Mexico. She lived to be 100 years old. She was born in 1889. And I say, tía, ¿por qué no hablas el inglés? Ah, ¿para qué? Yo no fui a ellos. Ellos vinieron a mí. I didn't go to them.
Yes.
They came to me. If they want to speak Spanish, I'll talk to them. But she knew some English. She could go to the store, and so forth. But she lived to be 100 years old. She was an adult before New Mexico even became a state. And so she, she was at the margin of the American macroculture. I would say she probably entered very little, certainly did not assimilate to the American macroculture. Now, she acculturated in that she could go to the Piggly Wiggly store or wherever and get her groceries and negotiate enough English. But, she was not a part of the American mainstream.
Yeah, so and sorry to interrupt you, but can you actually explain to the people who are viewing, because I'm pretty sure these words of assimilation and acculturation get thrown around a lot, and oftentimes a lot of people don't know the difference between them, but there is a kind of a fine line difference. Could you actually speak to that?
Yeah, well, go back to that former slide, if you would. Okay. So the struggle to survive is often caught up, so that when, for example, some of our forefathers first migrated here to the United States, there was a pressure to assimilate into the American macroculture and saying, hey, immigrants speak English. And in fact, a lot of Latinos went through the process of saying they were punished for speaking English in Spanish schools. So there was a great deal of pressure, not only from the institutions, but from their own parents, and saying, well, hijito, when you go to school, you better speak English and learn to speak English well, because if you want to get ahead. So as a result, a lot of Latinos emerged out of that early migration of the first immigrants to not even learn Spanish. And today you try to talk to them in Spanish, they don't speak Spanish. And we all know, friends and relatives who are like that, because they have assimilated. Now, some people choose to acculturate to more than one culture, and acculturation is a process where you take on aspects of the dominant culture, but you maintain aspects of your own culture, and you can integrate into both cultures. I'm probably a good example of that because I had the privilege of going to my grandparents in Mexico every summer, and they spoke Spanish, so I learned to speak Spanish. And going back to Denver or LA, depending on where my dad could find work, I learned both languages. So I am integrated, if you will, to both cultures. I can go to New Mexico and use my full name, Genovebo, and nobody laughs about that, and I can feel at home. I'm finally at home. I can be Genovebo instead of having to be Gene T. I can be Genovebo Teodoro Chavez Ortiz. And that feels really good to me. So because I'm not fully assimilated into the American macroculture. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's great. I kind of, was typing down the definitions there, but just pretty much like assimilation would be in its essence like the stripping of like the native culture, values, and beliefs, and in turn the adoption of the dominant customs and language and all of that. While acculturation would be the process where you take on the aspects of dominant culture but maintain it. So kind of just like integrating it into both cultures equally, kind of taking the best of both worlds, being able to code switch between different communities and stuff like that. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, and to hitchhike on that a little bit, think of the value of being bilingual, bicultural. We would pay money to have somebody be able to interpret. And yet, it's not valued. It's not highly valued in the American macro culture.
Yep.
I worked in public schools for most of my career, and they always expected me to interpret and to translate, but I didn't pay for it. So it wasn't. It was appreciated, but it wasn't valued to the extent of monetary remuneration. Let's go to the two more slides over. So when we think, when we compare those core values, we could compare them with other ethnic groups and think about the degree of acculturation and assimilation that various groups have made it. African Americans, for example, if they assimilate fully into the American macro culture, they have a better chance of surviving the American macro culture. If they remain at the margins of the American macro culture and don't fully assimilate, and that goes for almost any group, because usually the people in the American macro culture don't too much slack or value very much people maintaining their own cultural identity, language, dialect, and so forth. So when you think about a comparison, there are certain core values that are important to us as Latinos. For example, we value maintaining our ties to our native countries, whether it be Mexico or Puerto Rico or Guatemala or wherever. We still have a sense of being part of our identity, Guatemaltecos or Mexicanos or whatever country we come from. And I think that's an important thing. People who try to struggle within the American macro culture to maintain their identities sometimes have a difficult time doing that unless there is a support group. And that's why we find the barrio or the neighborhood that supports us in maintaining, I remember as a kid going and getting menudo every Sunday morning at the corner store.
Con tortillas a mano.
and on the stove all day long. And there was support for my cultural ways. I still have, now I have to go drive all the way to San Antonio's or wherever I go to get menudo. And I don't do it every Sunday morning like I did when I was a kid at home.
Yeah.
When my mom sent me to the store. So, trying to maintain cultural values without a support network is sometimes very difficult. And we sometimes struggle to maintain our sense of identity.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
All right, let's go to the next one. So, our cultural identity really depends a great deal on our interaction with the dominant culture. If we fully embrace the dominant language of the United States, it's going to be English. If we fully embrace the value of individualism, then we may cut our ties more often with our family members rather than sticking close to family. Yes. If we embrace the value of commercialism and fall into the trap of working two jobs just so we have things, we lose, something of our own culture that is a culture of sharing and being satisfied with the fundamentals rather than having to have the latest car and the BMW and all the other things that, I think in a commercialized, mercantile culture, it's difficult, not to start falling into that trap. We as a consumer, a very consumeristic macro culture, we buy and buy and buy until our houses get full, and then we have a garage sale or a yard sale.
Yes.
Yes. Some of it.
Yes, and now it's kind of just like now we're, I guess, taking kind of consumerism into our own hands, where we're choosing where our money goes now. So we're yes, still feeding into that consumerism and capitalistic society, but now it's going towards like Black and brown businesses. And so do you find that that's like similar and like a similar approach, or like a result of just like the times that we're in right now?
Well, yeah, I think that to a certain degree, you know, we're going just by virtue of our contact with the American macroculture, we are going to take on some of the values and customs and cultural ways of dominant society. That's inevitable, and you know, the further we are from our roots, the more difficult it is to maintain our own cultural ways. And that's always happened, you know, down to cultures down through the history of civilization. So the Greeks borrowed from the Persians, and the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, and so they became assimilated to a certain degree, or at least acculturated to one another's ways. And so the same thing is going to happen, but when we endeavor, like for example, Diana's organizations, to sort of recapture and maintain and think about and discuss and identify and value who we are as a cultural group, it brings value not only to our lives, but I think it brings value to the macro culture. If they're willing to accept. And I think we're kind of in a period of time with the upheaval that we're experiencing, where we could say, hey, we do have something to offer that maybe isn't completely in sync with the American macro culture, but it's a cultural way that has helped us to survive. And so we're going to share it with you. And I think that's the value of maintaining our cultural identity and cultural ways.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to move pretty fast through these. We want to get to the Kansas City scene and how that expressed itself. So the growth of diversity, if we were to chart it out, another little chart that I developed here, you know, previous to 1964, we lived in a macro culture, and notice how separated before 1964. So the American macro culture existed, and they say, "Oh, yeah, there are some Jewish people out there. Let's invite them to come in and talk to us at our church meeting or whatever." There are Latinos. I wonder if we could get a speaker for some activity, you know, Cinco de Mayo and September 16th, and talk about Mexican Independence Day. So they would reach out, if you will, and maybe try to bring it in. But after 1964, we saw a move towards a changing in perspective, in that people say, hey, not only are they out there in our American society, but we actually have to make it more interactive. And so there's where we are beginning to get board seats and beginning to get jobs that are professional, not just labor jobs and so forth. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where it was outlawed to discriminate outright against people of color because of national origin, race, so forth, we now have at least a seat at the table, or the possibility of a seat at the table. And so I think that eventually our perspective will continue, especially as we see, for example, Anglo people and others who are joining and coalescing with people of color to say, hey, social justice has to stop in this country. Institutional racism has to stop in this country. We have to work together. We have to dialogue. We have to talk. We have to understand one another. And I think we're moving to what James Banks, a educator and a professor at Washington University, State of Washington State University, calls a more multilingual, multicultural, multinational nation where we allow for our emblem or our symbol of unity, e pluribus unum, that's written on every dollar bill and coin in this country, one out of many, that we can become one, but let us allow people to have an emphasis on the pluralism that is pluribum in the Latin, so that we are recognized that we are a pluralistic nation made up of many different cultural groups. So let's go to the next one. And I know the background to the struggle. Why is it that we launched the Chicano movement? Why is it that the civil rights era with the Black protests and leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King came about? I think it's because we have some basic psychological needs as humans, no matter what culture we come from. First of all, we have a need for security. Everybody has to feel secure in their environment. If you don't feel secure in your environment, if you feel like just because you drive in a certain neighborhood, you could be profiled, pulled over, pulled out of your car, and someone put their knee to your neck, that's not fulfilling our psychological need for security. There is a need also for the sense that we have possessions, that we possess our homes, we possess our neighborhoods, we possess the things that are ours, and that we can acquire and possess them without the fear that somebody's going to come and take them from us.
Yeah.
I think we also have a psychological need for sensory satisfaction. We have to be able to live in neighborhoods that have parks and beautiful trees and flowers, and rather than, say, rundown houses or streets without trees or without flowers, without parks, green spaces. We have a need for recognition. We have to feel like, hey, we are a person of worth. We have value. And when those psychological needs are not being met, we create institutions to try to meet those needs. For example, the creation of gangs. Well, if you're a gang member, you can feel secure. If you're a gang member, you can have possessions. Make sure that, you can get what you want and need. You may also have sensory satisfaction. You wear your colors, you throw your signs, and then you recognize you're a blood.
100%.
Yeah. So that's an institution. Now that's not a positive institution. It's a negative institution. We don't want to promote that, but we do the same thing by all of our institutions, whether it's a church, whether it's education, all of those psychological needs. We build institutions to try to meet those needs. When people are denied those needs, then we have the potential for revolution, if you will.
Yeah, so and I think it's necessary that we specifically highlight that, because a lot of people that I think are in the dominant culture don't understand that there's a need for affinity groups like Black student unions, like Latino student unions, Asian student unions, and the list goes on. And a lot of the times the question, that's asked is why do we need groups like that? Why isn't that, segregating us more? It's because there's a lack of either security or recognition or sensory satisfaction or any of the elements that are on there that group isn't getting. And so they're taking it into their own hands and creating one. And so I think a lot of the times when you grow up never questioning your identity or never questioning the color of your skin or your security or any of these things, it's easy to kind of question and not understand the need to create your own space, to create your own group, and to feel like you belong to something within a bigger cosm of things. So yeah, I think it's super important that you bring that up.
Yeah, well said. Wow, thank you. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that happened to Latinos in the war of aggression that the United States launched against Mexico in 1846, and it lasted until the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, was in fact the taking or the annexation of all the Western territories. That was really part of northern Mexico before it was annexed by the United States and through the treaty agreement of 1848. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see, as indicated by the red highlighted states there, that was all part of Mexico before 1848. When you think about it, the international boundary between the United States and Mexico would look like that. And in our own state of Kansas, the Rio Grande River would not be the border, but in fact, the Arkansas River would be the border river, if you will. So when you look at Kansas, you kind of see a bend there, and that's where the Arkansas River takes a bend, and that's really where the international border was. And before 1803, with the Louisiana Purchase, the United States was really a very small nation. And when it acquired from France, which really had belonged to Spain previously, but because the Spanish crown was weakened and Napoleon captured Spain and took over Spain, and then needed some money to continue his wars, sold to Jefferson all of the Louisiana territory. So north of the red states there was the Louisiana territory. Anything west of Mississippi, in the South, Mississippi and so forth. And at one time, all of the southern states of Louisiana, Texas, Florida belonged to Spain as well. But going back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, the land that we see in red was considered by the Chicano movement, and even before the Chicano movement, and I'll trace a little bit of the history of that. But one of the ideologies of the Chicano movement was La Reconquista de Aztlán. That basically said, hey, we have a right to that land. We need to go and recapture that land and make it part of Aztlán. And El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, which was formulated at the Crusade for Justice in Denver, Corky Gonzalez's organization, that was really a plan that they had. And that plan for the Reconquista de Aztlán was really a movement, a national Chicano movement. When I say nationalism is that attitude and behavior that says, hey, we are going to be whatever we're going to be if it takes force, by all means necessary, as it was quoted by one black leader. And so there was that element in the Chicano movement that said, we are going to recapture Aztlán. Well, I moved from Kansas City because I had come out here to Kansas City in 1962, went to school here, and then moved back to Denver in 1969. And that was 1969 was the height of the Chicano movement. And we were doing school walkouts in Denver at the same time that they were happening, just shortly after they were happening in California, in Los Angeles. And so Denver Chicano youth were emulating that tactic to bring about reform in education. I remember going to some of the meetings at the Crusade for Justice, and they were talking about, hey, we got to gather guns, we got to become strong, but the brown beret guard the doors, and you couldn't get in. They stopped me at the door one time and say, no gringos here, you know. And I said, dígame en español, no entiendo qué estás diciendo. And okay, go ahead and go on. Because they thought, because I'm light complexion, they said they didn't want me in the meeting. But they got to know me, and so I would go in. But and so I challenged Corky. I said, Corky, let's just look at it. Either we take up arms and try to reconquer Aztlan by force, or we do it a different way. We do it by becoming educated, acquiring wealth, becoming senators and representatives, becoming politically active. And Corky was sort of on the fence. He wasn't a complete nationalist, but his son-in-law was very nationalistic and really, when he spoke, you know, he always spoke that nationalist rhetoric.
Yeah.
But when I actually sponsored, I was working at a community center in North Denver. It was after college, and I invited Corky to come and do a symposium with us. And so we took up that issue of the Reconquista de Aztlan. And he was a little more moderate and saying, well, you know, we have to recapture at least culturally who we are. And I can agree with, you know, but to try to reconquer Aztlan, and it wasn't a new idea. Let's go to the next slide. El Plan de San Diego, Texas, was really a plan that was developed by a leader in Mexico by the name of Carranza. He later became president after the during the time of the Mexican Revolution. But that was really, El Plan de San Diego really was the plan to reconquer the lost territory that was lost in the Mexican-American War.
Yeah.
And so that plan had been around for a long time. And it was really the model for El Plan Espiritual de Aztlan that Corky Gonzalez and some of his other lieutenants, and they call themselves lieutenants, tried to develop. But it really, fortunately, didn't go anywhere, because then it would have been an excuse for mass slaughter of Mexicanos, Chicanos, because there was no way we had enough guns. I mean, and it was a crazy idea to think about that. Let's go to the next slide. So let's move. And maybe, is there any question about that before we move on? How are we doing on time? Do we have 37 minutes, or we're 37 minutes into 38 minutes into the presentation?
So we have about 20 minutes. Sorry, I'm echoing.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, let's move forward then. One of the earliest, I'm sorry, go back to that slide, the LULAC slide. The League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, is the earliest civil rights organization among Latinos that organized nationally. There were local fraternities, and for example, here in Kansas City, when Mexican immigrants came to Kansas City, they formed organizations that were an effort to try to advocate for themselves. For example, a lot of cemeteries would not bury Blacks or Mexicanos in their cemetery, because they felt like that was mixing the races, and it wasn't right to do that. So that discrimination and segregation of the races was a very real thing here in Kansas City, and as it was nationally. The League of United Latin American Citizens was a national organization founded in 1929 and in Corpus Christi, Texas. And for the most part, it was a very conservative organization. For a lot of time, they would not even embrace the term Chicano. It wasn't until the Bonilla brothers took the leadership of LULAC that they were willing to acknowledge the Chicano movement, because they felt that they could, their organization needed to stick with, all of the protocols in the United States. And it's a great organization, and it's still an organization to this day. It's sort of like the NAACP. The NAACP and LULAC started about the same time to defend the rights of Black people in the case of the NAACP, and in the case of LULAC to defend the rights of Latinos. And so it was a relatively conservative, well, it was a very conservative organization, Latino organization, but has evolved to this day. And we still have some LULAC chapters. They're kind of dying out because the older people are dying out. But we still have some LULAC chapters. And we definitely have the LULAC National Education Resources that is headed up by a young man, and I'm blocking on his name, but I'll think of it later. Who's been with it now for a number of years to help young people with scholarships and so forth. So let's go to the next slide. Talk about another old line Hispanic organization. That's the American GI Forum. The American GI Forum was formed after World War II, and again, another reason for its formation was that a soldier in Texas, they would not bury him in his hometown in Texas because he was Mexicano, and they didn't have a Mexican cemetery in the town where he lived. And so the founder, Dr. Hector Garcia, said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. And so he started pushing for equal rights and social justice for Mexicanos. And so the American GI Forum took hold among returning GIs and their families, and the organization grew across the nation. Some of you may know, or some of our listeners may be members of the American GI Forum or family members. So it's an organization that's still around. It's kind of dying off, but it's still there, and it's definitely one of the early advocacy groups in this struggle for civil rights. Let's go to the next one. From the legal perspective, one of the things that the Chicano movement and other social justice movements among Latinos found out is that we could take up arms. We couldn't take up literally arms, but we could take law books and we could beat the system at its own game if we had lawyers who could go to court and advocate for civil rights. And MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, Education and Defense Fund, was one of those organizations formed right in the thick of the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. They formed in California and eventually moved out to Texas. They were formed in San Antonio and then moved throughout the nation. And now their headquarters are in Washington, D.C. So that organization is one that really I had envisioned when I was debating with Corky about trying to retake Aztlan. I said, we can retake certain aspects of Aztlan culturally, linguistically, educationally, economically, and we need the help of lawyers to do that. And that's why MALDEF is a very important organization to help with Latino civil rights. Let's go to the next one. Another organization, as women began to emerge in the movement, and they were right there from the very beginning in the civil rights movement. And women, we know, as we celebrate the centennial of the suffrage, women's suffrage and women's right to vote, how powerful women can be. And one of the organizations that formed was MANA, which eventually stood for Avanzando las Mujeres. And I'm not real sure what MANA, but it sort of morphed into just being called MANA. And the program really reached out, especially here in Kansas City, where there were a lot of members of MANA, the national organization, people like Becky Jaramillo, and people like Frida Mendez-Smith, later Mary Chavez, and a lot of the women here really formed a very strong MANA affiliate in Kansas City. And they also reached out to the young hermanitas, the young women, and mentored them, provided scholarships, did all kinds of training with young Latina women, and really were very strong here in Kansas City for a long time.
Are there still remnants of like MANA here in Kansas City, or just like any groups that like are modeled after them that still exist?
There are some of the members that still exist, but they used to have annual meetings and so forth, and it's kind of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce has kind of taken over some of those functions, and so some of the women in the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce are sort of taking on this mentorship role. We have Latinos of Tomorrow as part of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Greater Kansas City. We also have the Young Latino Professionals. And so a lot of mentoring is now taking place through those organizations. Let's go to the next slide. One of the organizations that has local affiliates of the national organization is the National Council of La Raza. When it was founded, it was really founded in the heat of the Chicano Movement days. And the organizers of the National Council of La Raza really had a vision, and that vision was to unite Hispanic organizations across the country. And they were very effective in doing that, especially under the leadership of their first executive director, who remained executive director. There's only been two executive directors of the organization, Raul Izaguirre, founder and executive director, and then Janet Murguia, who grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, who now heads the organization. And it's now has a new name called Unidos US to sort of keep up with the times. But the organization is still a very strong organization. El Centro, incorporated on the Kansas side, and Guadalupe Center on the Missouri side, are both affiliates of the national, formerly the National Council of La Raza, and the Unidos US now. And there have been some other organizations, but those are the two main organizations that are affiliated. They have an annual conference and have speakers, and really have a strong presence in Washington, D.C. And how they're sitting at the table of a lot of corporations and governmental organizations. When I say the Chicano movement came to Kansas City, it departed from the radical view, taking over and recapturing Aztlán, to becoming institutionalized in the sense that we can make a difference by using the organizations that exist, the institutions that exist, and push for change within those organizations. And let's go to the next slide. And I take just a little rabbit path here. Reyes Lopez Tijerina was one of those guys who tried to follow the path of succession or armed rebellion against governmental entities. And he decided that he was going to recapture Aztlan by going after the government for the land grants that had been made to the Spaniards when they migrated from Spain, and the viceroys and the kings gave them land grants. And so there were huge land grants throughout the Southwest. And Mexico did honor those land grants. So the large land grants, the large landholders, during the period of Mexican nationality, when it became a nation, honored those land grants. But the United States did not. So when the United States took it over, people began to lose those land grants. And Reyes Lopez Tijerina decided that he was going to take over the courthouse in Terra Amarilla in northern New Mexico. And so he took his arms and held his ground. And he actually escaped, but they did a manhunt. It was one of the largest manhunts in New Mexico and the United States. They finally captured him in that lower picture. And but after he did his jail time, I invited him to Arizona State University. I had started an organization called Raza Graduate Student Caucus, and we were affiliated with NCLR, with the National Council of La Raza, and so we would. Our main goal was based on the Plan de Santa Barbara, and let's go to the next slide because I think I outlined that real quickly. But let's go past that because we've already talked about that, and let's go past this one. And next one, we've talked about the ideology. Let's go to the next one. Oh, we did form coalitions, by the way. One of the real emphasis in the Chicano movement was to form coalitions with people of color. So there was a lot of coalition building between Blacks and Native Americans with the Chicano movement. Yeah. Let's go to the next one. And the next one. Oh, yeah, let's go to the next one because there it outlines the manifesto of the Plan de Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara, the University of California at Santa Barbara, a group of Chicano students decided that they would develop a plan and a manifesto. And it was really designed to bring change in university environments. And so their demands had to do with admissions and not being discriminatory in their admission policies. It had to do with curriculum changes and incorporating Chicano studies into the curriculum. It had to do with support for research about Latino issues and Hispanic Chicano issues. So it really was a plan to bring about change at higher education. And guess what? That plan really helped shape colleges and universities. I know at Arizona State University, when I formed the Raza Graduate Student Caucus, I went to the Dean of Students and he said, all right, let's start a chapter and I'll help support it. Eventually came an office of diversity at the university. And so that was a way to bring about change. Let's go to the next one and we'll get to more specifics with regards to Kansas City. So the struggle continues. And when you think about Kansas City, here is just a list off the top of my head that I put together of organizations. There's a Olathe Latino Coalition headed up by Maria Chavez, Mary Chavez, and Mary Lou Jaramillo. The other organizations that exist in Kansas City that are an outgrowth of the civil unrest that took place during the Chicano movement includes others that are listed here, and I can't list them all. But when you think about these organizations like Latinos of Tomorrow and Young Latino Professionals, even the one of the most recent ones, the Latinx Educational Coalition that you all know about, man, you guys are doing fantastic work to carry on the struggle. And, the struggle started way back, at the time that we lost Aslan. But, you're reconquering Aslan by getting involved in these kinds of organizations. And Nuestra Herencia, KC is a website that I started. I give the website there where I'm trying to document from a historical standpoint all of these. And I'll post this slide presentation on that site. So the organizations that Diana and Edgar and others are heading up are doing fantastic work. And then there are more mainstream organizations like the Guadalupe Center, El Centro, the LULAC National Education Service Center, and the other organizations that I have listed there. And the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, they came out of trying to reconquer economic security for our people.
And I think it's important. I think it's important to know before we do that. A lot of these organizations are very educationally based or politically based or like lawyers and just different type of things that generally are more systematic. But I definitely think, and you can definitely push back on this if you'd like, but I definitely think that there's a role for everybody and there's a need for that direct, like on the ground action that, protest does bring about. And that, those ideologies of maybe that are sometimes deemed more radical, getting back Aslan, like physically and stuff like that, like it is also necessary because that's where the walkouts came from. They're in your face and you couldn't look away and you had to listen. And while at the same time, getting an education, breaking generational, curses by, gaining generational wealth. While that's super important, it's also equally as important to do the groundwork to be able to get like down to the nitty and gritty and for some people like put their life on the line while everybody else or other people are taking up their own roles in the fight. And so I definitely want to like make sure that we emphasize that like there's a role for everybody in this fight, whether you're Chicano or whether you are in like the Black Lives Matter movement or an ally in either of them. It's important to notice that like if your role is in education, do it all the way. If your role is in, protests or policy, all the way and stuff like that. So I think that's important to emphasize, and knowing that like Kansas City is just an ever growing like metropolitan city that is just each day being put on the map for another reason. I think it's really important to know that just encourage people, there's a role for everybody. And if you're not doing X, Y, or Z, it doesn't mean you're not contributing to the cause or anything like that.
That's right. I you don't have to have letters behind your name in order to take up the struggle, and you make a good point. So I appreciate that. Let's go to the last slide. And when you think about individuals, I have a whole list of individuals who have made a difference, who have been to varying degrees outspoken advocates for social justice and change. And when you look at the lives of these individuals and others who are even unnamed, but who, but let me just take the first one on the list. The second one, Chepe. He was an artist, but he would make posters, and during the 74 through 76 visit of Cesar Chavez through Kansas City, he would design posters, and then he and his family would go and march with people with these big posters, and then he would supply posters to people to go to Safeway and other grocery stores and boycott grapes and lettuce. Those were the kinds of activists that we needed, as you're talking about, that would say, hey, we're here and our voice needs to be heard. And Chepe Alonso was one of those guys, and not only him, but his family, his wife, his children talk about when they were kids carrying those signs and then camping out at Safeway or some other grocery store where they were making a statement for, the movement.
Yeah.
So I'll leave off with that list because that would be one that I think would deserve really some intensive study for those who would like to study that list.
Yeah.
Dr. Chavez, I'm so impressed.
Well, I think I'm blessed from the standpoint of having been able to live through the movement and really see how it evolved.
Yeah, no, I really, really do think, I think Diana's a little, I don't know, I think her internet's a little weird. But I definitely want to thank you so much for your time and for your information and the wealth of knowledge that you bring around this subject. It's amazing to see the numbers and the graphs, but also to see like the stories behind it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chavez. Thank you.
Yeah.